Welcome to the Big Mike Fun Podcast, where you'll learn about advanced wealth building strategies from real estate investing to creating massive ROI and secured retirement profits. So pour yourself a cup of coffee, grab a notepad, and lean in. Because Big Mike has got the mic, starting now.
Welcome to the Big Mike Fun Podcast. I'm the Big Mike
Zlatnik, and today it is my pleasure and a privilege to welcome back Frances Stacy. Hi, Frances.
Hi, Mike.
Thank you very much, Frances, for coming back on a podcast. You were a guest a few times. You were absolutely awesome, and just so grateful to have you back. You are so brilliant. I don't want to have enough. Thank you for your time. And just as an introduction, Frances is the Director of Strategy at Untitled Chapter, and she is a frequent speaker, guest on many business TV programs, Fox Business, Bloomberg. I'm sure I'm missing a ton of them. You've been a co-host with Maria Bartiromo. So thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Yes, it's my pleasure. And thank you for your kind compliments.
All right, so let's jump straight into the episode. And I've got a bunch of questions prepared, and you're just so brilliant. But give us a little bit of, we're recording this in mid-March, but give us a little bit of your view of the world. What's happening with inflation in the United States? It feels like it's been coming down, but it's sticky, and the government, it's an election year. The government wants to spend money, at least politicians, that's their sport. And it's hard to control inflation with government spending a lot. So just would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, just quickly, the real problem is that when we had COVID, we put a record amount of money in the system, both on the fiscal and monetary side. And that caused inflation, because the basic and simple definition of inflation, or deflation as the case may be, it's the ratio of money in circulation against goods and services, right? So when you add that much money, and then for COVID, you had a record amount of money infused into the system, and then you had the supply chain constraints from COVID lockdowns, you're reducing the goods and increasing the money. So you're exacerbating that ratio. What did we get? We got 9% inflation, and then the Fed had to do it. The challenge with getting rid of or fighting inflation is then you want to bring that ratio of taking money out of the system relative to the goods and services and bring that back into balance. So what we've seen is that the Fed raised interest rates sort of at a record rate. And we have also seen, goods and services come back online. And then, the tightening has long and variable lags, as Jay Powell will tell you. And that kind of started to show some slowing in the manufacturing, but services kind of carried it. Now we're seeing some manufacturing kind of come back in. The big problem with the Fed, quote unquote, entering any kind of tightening cycle, or particularly an aggressive tightening cycle to handle inflation, is that all that money that was freshly put in, you can remove liquidity from the system, but you can't remove the debt. And that was a record amount of leverage put in the system. And now that record amount of leverage needs to be serviced. Well, what does that look like? Well, now the government needs to spend more to service this debt. Well, when they spend more, that counteracts some of the tightening of taking the money out of the system, because their spending is putting more money in the system. And my favorite analogy to use is the swimming pool. So you've constantly got a drain at the bottom of the swimming pool, and the spigots coming in are more money into the system. And what happens is the Fed tries to kind of open up that drain and reduce the spigots, but then the federal government has to, increase those spigots. And they do have all kinds of, they have, their service on the debt has gone up, and, several programs that came into place during COVID have gone up, and fiscal spending has gone up. So fiscal spending keeps the economy liquid, which is great. But even the labor market, which is a lagging indicator, a lot of the labor that's been added that is keeping the labor market robust are government jobs. And so what happens then is you kind of counteract the tightening that's occurring with the Fed, and then you get sort of sticky inflation, which is what we're seeing, where inflation is decelerating, but it's starting to kind of find some kind of a bottom here. And it looks like it's going to be a little harder to get it down to that 2% when the fiscal spending remains so high.
That's a great analogy. Any action that the Fed takes has, like you said, long and variable legs, and it has sometimes unintended consequences. So the higher debt service payments because of high interest rates are just transferring money back into the system. You're trying to remove the liquidity, but you're paying higher debt service, and that money is flowing back into the system. So now investors are getting those dollars, and they have more to spend because they're now earning higher rate of return. It's kind of like the similar analogy happens in real estate. When you raise interest rates, you would think interest rates prices would fall, but it's been tricky on the residential side. We haven't seen the fall of the housing costs. It's kind of a high interest rates have actually caused housing, the part of the inflation that is associated with housing, to be higher and stickier. It's almost counterintuitive, like they're pushing one pedal and another one is fighting them back. So
Yeah, so this is another kind of key point, and you make an excellent point. And again, the problem with residential real estate is obviously a shortage in supply, and that's going to keep even when you take down the demand, so interest rates affect the demand side. If you have a shortage of supply, that's going to keep those prices high. And the thing is that we have a completely bifurcated economy, meaning the upper 40% who own assets can still pay for that real estate. So they're still creating demand, and that's keeping those prices high. Whereas the lower 60% are living paycheck to paycheck. They're paying onerous interest rates on their credit cards, and they are being priced out of the housing market. They're being priced out of other markets. And so it's weird because the Fed policy, because those different sectors of the economy, those different social levels of the economy are affected differently by Fed policy, you're getting these extreme reactions. And so then the Fed sort of pours on more tightening and more tightening and more tightening just to, really make sure that inflation doesn't come back. And the problem is that bottom 60%, at some point, then the risk is increased that they're going to fall off as consumers. To what degree, we don't know. So they're trying to, the tools that they have are not designed to treat those two classes differently. But that's kind of what's happening in the economy, is that you're not getting the intended effects because you're having a compensation factor from these other classes. And because the upper 40% did fairly well during COVID, they're also providing private credit, which is completely buffering credit markets. And that's a good thing because we're not having a credit event. But usually what happens when the Fed tightens, the yield curve inverts. The banks stop lending as a result because they have to pay higher deposit costs than they're getting in longer term loans when the yield curve inverts, and they don't, they're not fans of negative income. So they stop lending, and that's turning a spigot off for the swimming pool. Well, in this case, you had so much liquidity in the upper 40% that private credit swooped in and just took over for the banks. And that was sort of an unintended consequence. So as the system goes forward, these tools are not as effective as they have been historically. And I think that's where the predictions have gone awry. And I'm guilty of it too. We expected this record amount of tightening to create this big effect, and it did. It got inflation down. But it's interesting that the business cycle, I would say, is not broken, but it's been elongated in this sort of cause and effect and reaction because of these different, classes of the economy kind of being affected in these different ways. And what ends up happening is now you've got the government and now you've got private credit sort of compensating for this tightening, which is just elongating the business cycle.
That's a brilliant explanation. The private credit logic is interest rates have gone up. It has become more attractive for the private credit to put the money to work, especially when the banks withdrew their liquidity and their lending capacity because of the Fed tightening. So the private credit is just substituting in mass because it's just so much more attractive to loan the money in this environment for private capital. So it's what this proves is that exactly what you said, Fed tools, or at least they don't have the ability to really impact inflation the way they thought they would. So they did what they could, but in reality, market forces actually dominating or not dominating, but market forces are stepping in and substituting what Fed is trying to do. It's kind of a weird side effect, but that's how capitalism works, I guess.
Yeah, it is interesting. I think that when you study the debt cycles and you study the business cycles, every iteration of the business or credit cycle does widen the wealth gap, because the top, 1% or 40%, they have opportunities to make money in both inflationary and deflationary environments. And they have opportunities to make money when growth is accelerating and growth is decelerating, or even in a negative growth scenario. So, and then the lower 60% get killed in all of those seasons of the business cycle. So you've got the season of growth and inflation going up together. You've got a season of inflation going up and growth going down. You've got a season of growth going up and inflation going down. And then you've got a season of growth and inflation both going down together. So those are the 4 seasons of the credit cycle. And the lower 60% loses on all of those cycles because, either they're getting laid off and losing their jobs, or they have a job, but their wages are sticky and they're paying for a higher cost of living with inflation. So if you compound the effects on the lower 60% and the upper 40% over an iteration of many business cycles, and particularly COVID was a very exaggerated, part of the cycle, you see these effects get very severe. And Ray Dalio, of course, has done a lot of research on what happens. And when you get very late stage with this wealth gap where you're losing the middle class and you've got, 60% are so over levered, they're putting groceries on credit cards, and the 40% are like, buy me 3 more yachts. I need the tax write-off. I'll put my company logo on it, that kind of stuff. You have this extreme populism that starts to bubble on both the left and the right. And it is anger and it's frustration because on one side, it's life is becoming increasingly unlivable, and the other side is doing so well and buffering these things, which is keeping the government and keeping the Fed from being able to effectively have to address the lower 60%. And so when politicians get on stage and they're like, my economic plans have created expansion and look how high the stock market is, that's not really benefiting a certain percentage of people out there. And that's what's fomenting this sort of populism on both sides. And so then what you quintessentially have, according to Dalio's research, is then you get a country that goes into a bit of a crisis. They lose their world power status, and then they sort of have a reset and a jubilee and have to start over, and they have to have a complete restructuring. And so if you are to follow that logic, the United States is in the late stages of that. And of course, I think that's the serious conversation that both the Fed and politicians should be having, is using that research and saying, like, how do we interrupt the mechanical aspects of this cycle?
Yeah, I appreciate that, caller, and I'm certainly familiar with this. And just for the audience, folks could certainly pick up these wonderful books. So it's Navigating Big Debt Crisis and Navigating the Principles on Navigating Changing World Order. Those are the 2 big books that describe what you described, and we're sort of on the stage 5, and hopefully we don't get into stage 6, which means blood in the streets.
Yeah, and that's it. And it's just kind of looking at the system, first of all, there's the humanity aspect of it, right? So obviously people are hurting, and you have to have a lot of compassion. But when you look at adjusting the monetary and fiscal policies, you have to have a somewhat mechanical approach in saying that, look, if this concatenation of lever movement always ends up here, and we want it to end up in a different result, we've got to change some of the internal mechanics of the system. But aside from that, this is the Fed's challenge. And so the Fed has sort of a fork in the road, which is they can preemptively start to become dovish and cut rates and change the rate at which they're reducing the balance sheet and sort of ameliorate their tightening, sort of trying not to push us into the stage 6, and sort of trying to say, okay, I don't really want to push and find out where that threshold is, where the system just starts to kind of break, which usually looks like rampant defaults, right? You've got over-levered corporate credit that's maturing. You've got over-leveraged commercial real estate loans that are maturing. And then you've got this issue with the consumer and the record amount of credit card usage, and credit cards having, super high, highest ever interest rates. And so you don't know really what shoe is going to drop. And so Powell has an opportunity to say, all right, I'm not going to wait for one of those to fall apart. The other side of it is that he doesn't know where the threshold is when you think about the ratio of money in circulation to goods and services, because money is being created and destroyed every nanosecond. Every time somebody uses a credit card, every time somebody pays a credit card, every time somebody extends debt, it goes into the system. Every time somebody repays debt, it comes out of the system. So this is changing by trillions of transactions that are constantly moving, right? And so you have to look at the larger trend on that. And then the other thing is the goods and services, that's also changing. And when you implement policy, there are always lagging effects to policy. So there is a bit of a wait and see approach to this. And the other thing to do, and I liken it to a game of musical chairs where you just start reducing chairs. And then when the music, when the music stops, somebody's without a chair. It's his other option is to just keep things higher for longer so that he sees when the system breaks, where the threshold is. And then because he now has certainty about where the threshold is, he has an opportunity to kind of control it. I am certain, because that's what I would do if I were in his shoes, he has a number of pre-planned pivot possibilities should one of these shoes drop. He's not going to say that publicly because that's going to have the markets going bananas. They parse through every sentence and every comma and every semicolon in those Fed statements. So, he's not going to say anything alarming. I think that would be irresponsible. But just understanding how this thing works mechanically, he's got to be thinking, okay, if we have a credit crisis, and credit crises happen slowly and then all at once, what's my pre-planned reaction? And depending on the severity and the level of contagion in that crisis will determine how grandiose his reaction is. And his precedent is COVID. And when COVID, the market started falling off of a cliff, he intervened pretty dramatically, backstopping some credit that was sort of unprecedented in the US. We haven't backstopped equities yet, but that did happen in Japan at one point in time. So we just haven't done it in the US yet. So he definitely, I'm sure, has some things that he's ready to go. So he just has to make the choice of, do I preemptively cut, risk the reacceleration in inflation, and then deal with that? Or do I just wait until I find that threshold, knowing that I have the tools to handle the threshold? And that's his challenge.
That's a brilliant description of the dilemma that Jay Powell is facing and the fact that he's preparing for these possibilities. But what you just described, to me, it sounded like this: preventive medicine versus treating somebody when they're having a heart attack. And under normal circumstances, you give them aspirin or other blood thinners, and you try to deal with the risks of a heart attack. But if you're not sure a heart attack is going to happen, you're not clear, and you sit there and you wait and you just monitor, and the moment you see real data pointing towards a heart attack, then you act. But it sounds like, given the options, he cannot be a doctor practicing preventive medicine. He has to be a doctor, an emergency room doctor dealing with the emergencies. That's what it sounds like.
Well, and also that's a great analogy. And to add to your analogy, the problem with the preventative is you think that they have sort of somewhat of you think you have an idea of what kind of heart situation they have. And, you give them the thinners thinking that you're going to try and prevent any kind of blockages or clotting. But, you're not operating on this level of certainty because you haven't cracked the guy open and you don't know what you're really looking at. And then there are the unintended consequences potentially of giving them too much aspirin or too much something, and they have problems with their stomach lining, or that creates some other situation, which would be, sort of like the reaccelerating inflation. Because it's not just like, okay, let's just prevent the heart attack, so let's lower rates to prevent the heart attack. There could be the unintended consequences of a reacceleration in inflation. And then they're going to have to hit it even harder, because it's kind of like cancer. When it grows the first time, you hit it. But if you don't hit it hard enough, it grows back the second time. It takes on this sort of resistive nature. And then you have to hit it even harder, potentially having to do more damage. Whereas if you just wait till the guy has a heart attack, you open him up and you know what valve to treat.
Yeah.
So you get some kind of, even though you let it go to that point, you get some kind of certainty, and you can be more precise with your tools if you understand where these thresholds are or what the heart looks like. But then you can't really go, well, I want the guy to have a heart attack, so I have certainty. And that is the catch-22 that Powell's in, right? Because he knows that he has to push unemployment up, and yet those are real people losing jobs. And obviously Congress brings that up with him. Real people losing jobs, real people have to suffer. And that's kind of, how the tools work. And so until we can invent some better tools, or we can come up with mechanical adjustments internally in the system, he's got what he's got. He's subject to the limitations of what he's got. If we drive Volkswagens or Ferraris or Ford trucks, we've got what we've got. And so, and that's, sort of where he's sitting there. And I think probably what he's doing, and, I'm not against him. I understand the mechanical limitations that are in place, well-established legal precedent and other things that, more time equals more data, really. And according to market people, look, he's gotten this really right. He's had this massive deceleration in inflation. The stock market is still up. GDP is still up. The labor market hasn't fallen apart. He looks like a genius to market people. But the people who are not market people and who are not benefiting from this are not doing well. And, he probably doesn't look, to whatever degree they understand what's happening, he probably doesn't look as much like a genius to them, because their livelihood has changed. Their cost of living has changed. Their wages are sticky. They're taking on additional jobs, temp jobs, et cetera. And, life isn't easier for them. And then, the politicians are trying to appeal to all of these people, and appealing to the upper 40% is completely different, almost diametrically opposed, as appealing to the lower 60%. And that becomes very tough.
Yeah, I appreciate that clarification. On the surface, it looks like Jay Powell has done what they call a soft landing, or has orchestrated soft landing, but in reality, to plenty of people, he's created all kinds of extreme pain. And commercial real estate is one of the sectors where he withdrew a massive drug called ZERP fast, and is causing all kinds of challenges. And it's unclear when he's going to reverse his direction again. Just like you pointed out, he's sitting and waiting for more data, slower decision process. Unless some breaks, he's in this very slow, careful mode not to crack the chest before a patient is having a heart attack. So let's proceed along these lines. So two, I guess, follow-up questions. One, kind of what do you see the rest of 2024? I mean, two primary scenarios, maybe three scenarios. Let's call scenario one, where things are not breaking too hard, too fast, kind of just gradually, inflation is slowly coming down. So what Fed is likely going to do, how many cuts if nothing breaks. Second scenario, what if stuff starts breaking? And we've got some ripples in the water with the banking system. New York Community Bank announced really bad earnings, more reserves, and they raised emergency capital from previous. Was Mnuchin Secretary of Treasury or Secretary of Commerce? But Mnuchin,
Steve Mnuchin was Secretary.
Yeah, gave him $1 billion.
Oh wow. Okay, so
I don't know if you follow that. So Mnuchin gave New York Community Bank $1 billion as a rescue. Otherwise, the bank looked like they were going to go under. It didn't look too good. So
no,
the bank
I haven't been keeping up on.
weak.
System would be weak. What happened was even the Fed, has some bonds on the balance sheet that are not paying as much as they have to pay depositors, right? And that was what happened when Signature Bank and First Republic and Silicon Valley Bank and those things, that when they struggled, is that they've got negative revenue in the sense that the new loans, the old loans that they have on the books aren't paying what they owe depositors in interest rates. So what's happening is that they have this bond portfolio, and the bond portfolio is just upside down because the new bonds that are coming into the system are paying 4 or 5. And the bonds that they have on the books are paying 2 or 3 or something like that. And if they were to sell those bonds in the open market, they would take a massive haircut on the face value of those bonds in order to be competitive and compensate for the change in interest rates. And so what happened was when those banks went down, the Fed came in with a new facility, and they said, look, we will let you collateralize the loan with the bonds at par, meaning we will not take that discount off of the face value. And okay, that's great. But what's interesting is they're still getting paid the 2 or 3% by those bonds. And now that, they've taken on this additional loan to remain liquid, they're paying today's interest rates, which are much higher, on those loans, right? So it's still sort of a negative revenue scenario. And I was a little surprised but the Fed has to get paid that much, because they have to pay, So that's what's really occurred. And the banking system's become weak, and then the banks stop lending because they have to pay depositors more than they can take in on longer term loans and that kind of thing. And then society just becomes a little less creditworthy as well, as they get over levered personally and businesses get over levered, and the sort of domino effect of what's occurred. Even some of the projects that you're talking about in commercial real estate, are looking a little less creditworthy. And so you've got that coming into play. And I agree with you. I'm not defending Powell. I'm just saying that it helps me to mechanically look at the limitations of what he can and can't do, and then sort of read the tea leaves of which fork in the road I think he's taking, so that I can anticipate that for, my clients, our portfolios, and, anybody who were to ask me. And that's what I think that, I can't change the system overnight, and I certainly can't change his tools overnight, even if I do find them very frustrating. So that's the thing, is I try to, have my clients be able to win more than they lose, given some of these anomalies coming out of COVID. And the thing about COVID that also is very interesting is that these quintessential reactions, as you go through these phases of the business cycle, have become, I don't know what the word is, but they've become very sort of severe and reactionary and jerky. It hasn't been like a smooth unwinding where you have these well-greased gears in the system that are just sort of oiled and they're rolling through whatever they roll through. There have been a lot of starts and stops and changes, and it hasn't been very smooth. And so that also is creating, abnormal reactions that are sort of freaking everybody out. And then they think, oh, well, they start to throw the whole business cycle out the window. The business cycle is not dead. It's just been adjusted a little. The timing of the reactions, the dominoes have been adjusted. And the reason I argue that it's not dead is because our monetary system is still based on the same nature of credit. And until we have a monetary system that's not based on credit, which I'm saying, there's good and bad to that as well. There are certainly some problems with a system that wouldn't be based on credit. That the business cycle is the business cycle, and it has to do with, putting excess liquid. It's like, the ebb and flow of a shore during tide. You liquefy, and that's high tide, and then it gets a little too close, and it gets a little too close to the houses, and the water gets a little too deep, and the tide rolls back out again, and that's what you have happen. So
yeah, I appreciate that, but the business cycle is going through sort of modifications and evolutions and adjustments. So it's almost like it's not a circle, it's a spiral in a way. In the next iteration of it, it's a little different. So I agree with you. The business cycle is not broken.
It feels different.
Affected.
The mechanics are in essence the same, but it feels different. And particularly if we were to generalize, which is hard, because obviously people's personal experiences are their personal experiences, but it feels different to the upper 40% than it does to the lower 60%. And wherever anybody falls along those tiers. And I'm not saying the upper 40% doesn't feel any pain, or the lower 60% isn't benefited in any way. I mean, their wages are going up. But yeah, it feels a little bit different. Mechanically, it hasn't changed.
Well, just the real basic thought process of where majority of the wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer folks, and high interest rates enable fewer folks to earn higher rates of return, where the majority, again, 60%. I would probably put it more like 80-20, but
probably,
the unfortunately, they have fewer savings, so the high interest rates are not helping them. And in fact, because a lot of them borrow on credit cards and similar, they wind up paying higher cost of debt. And the effect of what Powell has implemented it's actually been more painful for the masses than the positives that he has created for the upper echelon, without taking any political view. Well, let me
No.
switch the conversation. I certainly would love.
Well, I
any
just want
comments on this.
to add one thing to what you've just said, because it's very important. And that is sort of, if there was something that was unworkable in the system, or if there was sort of an injustice in the system, right? That's the thing, is poorer people pay more for everything, because they're not able to go and do the deals that people who can buy people who have money can buy greater quantities. They can negotiate better deals. They're paying in cash. And if you think about the different discounted cash flow formulas, it's a big deal when you compound that over years. Whereas people, even groceries, if somebody's putting groceries on their credit card, they're paying a 20% premium on those groceries by virtue of the fact that they're putting them on a credit card that has a 20 some odd percent interest rate at this point in time. So, and that is part of what happens, is that's how poorer people get poorer and richer people get richer, is that sort of thing. And so if we have inequality in the system, it's like we ask poorer people to buy the same things, and we ask them to pay more for those same things, and then that puts more pressure on them.
No, understood. And I have no delusions. I grew up in the former Soviet Union, and the communist socialistic systems, in my view, have bigger problems than what the US capitalism has. But the system inherently, it's difficult to say what's fair, what's unfair, depending on your point of view.
Yeah.
So I can tell you that certainly feel for the majority of the folks, you want to come up with a system, or economic or financial system, that gives equal opportunity regardless of where you grew up or who your parents are. So from that perspective, I concur with you 100%. But let me switch to just one more topic. I know we've been talking, we're way past the time, but I just want to touch on one more, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure.
So immigration. Is immigration, and we've seen two types of immigration. One, let's just call them legal immigration, and two, undocumented or illegal. And I came into the country as a legal immigrant, political refugee from the former USSR. A lot of folks are running over the border right now, coming into the United States as undocumented, call them illegal, or depending on your point of view, it's the same thing. They're just coming over the border. And then they wind up in many sanctuary cities, other parts of the country, and these cities didn't budget for this. They didn't prepare for this. There's no shelter. They have to come up with shelter, food, medicine, schooling, all that stuff. So, from an economic perspective, is this inflationary or deflationary? What's really happening here, and how do you solve the problem? Are you able to all these folks already here? Are you able to get them to work to solve the very low unemployment problem? And what is it going to do to other folks who are working today? And suddenly you got masses of other folks who will enter the system and try to take their jobs.
Well, it's going to take some time to see what the real outcome. It's kind of like COVID, right? It's going to throw some wrenches in the system, and it's hard. You can make the argument that it's going to be deflationary for wages, which is lessens the pressure of inflation of wages, because there are more people ready and willing to work. But it just depends. Are these people able to take the jobs that are open? And this is not by any stretch of the imagination my area of expertise. If they were to come in and somehow attribute to increasing production, then that affects GDP. I think what I'm finding and what I'm hearing is that because these guys are coming in and they can't immediately fill those gaps because they don't have the skill set, or they don't have, it's just not, it's not quite the right fit just initially, because there is a skills gap even when you're not referring to undocumented, migrants. There is a lag effect where they cost the system more than they're able to contribute to the system. And it's exactly what you're saying, where, these cities are unprepared for it. And then, to the extent that these people are not productive, or they're criminals, or they're hungry, and so then they do crime or whatever kind of drugs are involved, then that sort of takes that, age-old idea that if you bring more people into the country, then you have more labor. And it sort of just puts a bit of a wrench in it. I think that them coming in undocumented, there are going to be unintended consequences. You don't know who you're letting in. You don't really know what effect they're going to have on society. And you don't know and have no way of predicting how well they're going to be able to integrate into society productively. And what I'm understanding from people such as yourself who came in legally, of course, I'm a US citizen, I was born here, but what I understand from people such as yourself is it's very frustrating to watch this because of how hard they had to work to get in here legally. I have a elderly couple that's in their 70s who got married. She's Australian, he's American, and they're giving her, they're not just giving her citizenship because she married an American. And I even, had to write in a letter saying that they're genuinely romantically inclined and it's not just some arrangement. And, and that's crazy because they are a completely legitimate couple and they're very productive business owners and, no criminal records and squeaky clean, and they're having a tough time. And then because we weren't prepared for the amount of influx, particularly New York City, you're seeing it, then the administration is solving this by giving them money. And now not only did they not have to work as hard to get in, they're being handed money and, places to live and resources and benefits and stuff like that, that some of our vets and some other people, are having a tougher time getting. And I think that that's an injustice. It's an injustice to the people who came here legally. It's injustice to the existing American citizens. And it's not that I don't have a humanitarian approach to refugees or people that want to change their circumstances in life, but we cannot get violent enough or poor enough or sick enough or any of those things to uplift other people. And so if America is going to be this place where people get an opportunity at the American dream, the more we degrade America, the less opportunity America has to provide the American dream. And the problem with this is that it's too much too fast. The system is having a tough time absorbing it, and it's going to harm America's ability to be America. And then if we can't be America because our ability is harmed to be America, then these people coming in aren't going to benefit from the American dream anyway, even if you're operating on a purely humanitarian basis. And systems just don't tend to do really well when you do really extreme things really quickly. And it's the same thing with the Fed. They raised interest rates so quickly that, that curve is so steep that they did it so quickly that it was tough for the system to absorb. And then you have the unintended consequences. And I feel the same way about the immigration, to the extent that it's too much too fast. And then you don't know who you're letting in. And these people, some of them are committing crimes and killing Americans and things like that. That's a tough pill to swallow.
Brilliant commentary. I'll try to quote you if I remember it correctly, but this is the key message. We can't degrade America far enough. Otherwise, the American dream will be gone. So the rapid immigration through undocumented is degrading the American dream. It's degrading the American way of life, and that's the risk. And as you said, again, I'm just repeating this because I happen to agree with you 100%. The change is part of life. That's the only thing that's guaranteed in life is change. But when the change is too fast and too rapid, that's a big problem because it destabilizes the society, destabilizes financial system. And that's where, by the way, I think on the record, that Jay Powell made an error in moving rates up so fast and so furious. I think we would have done just as well with a slower pace of changes. But my theories will never get a chance to be tested. Things went the way they went. And then we're living it, and the consequences are yet to be discovered. Future is just it's not written, so we'll play it by year.
Well, that's the thing is all of those choices. I'm not defending him in any way, shape, or form. I think he had a very difficult situation to deal with, but had he done it more slowly, who knows? That may have been absolutely brilliant, and that may have caused other problems with inflation. It's just really hard to say. And that's why this fork in the road that he has in front of him, it's really hard to say, because you cannot perfectly predict all of the unintended consequences. I mean, when you look at investing in portfolios and even real estate investing or whatever sector of the economy that you're investing in, there are just trillions of variables that are moving all the time. And you try to strike a balance of all of these moving variables. And that is the thing, exactly. If you shock the system by making a rapid change too quickly, the system can't absorb it, and you're going to have more disruption and displacement and mispricing. And whether that's political with immigration or whether that is in financial markets with the Fed tightening. And I'm not really a political person, and I certainly have compassion for humans and compassion for all sides. But yeah, if you degrade the American dream, even the migrants that you're trying to give the American dream will not benefit from the American dream. And I think that's sort of one of those things that hopefully we can kind of, get some order put into this and make some changes so that isn't the case, because that would be genuinely a tragedy.
Frances, thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for sharing. 30 minutes episode became way longer, but I think a lot of brilliant comments here, and I'm so grateful for you coming on a podcast. We have to do this again soon enough, but in the meanwhile, thank you. How would folks reach out if you want to share information? Of course, they can find you on many TV channels, but is there a way, folks, if you wanted to share information?
Yes, thank you. So I appreciate that. If you want to follow what I'm saying on TV or news outlets, the best way to do that is connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn. And that's Frances Newton, Newton Stacy, Stacy on LinkedIn. And then, if you want to have a deeper discussion with one of my team members about your portfolio or how you want to hedge your real estate investments, maybe your real estate investments are completely viable, but they've taken on various delays, I'm happy to have a conversation with you at Optimal. And, you can send me an email at frances@optimalcapital.com. And that's FRANCES, France with an S, at optimalcapital.com. And I would be delighted to talk to any of your audience and continue this conversation and navigating these sort of unusual times.
Yeah, we got to write a book navigating not the big debt crisis, but something else. One final comment I had, and it just kind of the thought has come to mind. But and you know this better than anyone else, normally Fed eased fast and raised slow. And here, this is one of those weird times where they raised fast, and they are probably going to ease slow. So we'll see what the future holds. But
right, it's either going to be a hero or a zero. But the thing that's interesting is, and I had this conversation with somebody. I'll make one final comment. I had this conversation with somebody yesterday. There's a human temptation that we all have, and if there's a human temptation that we do something that works, and then suddenly we get this big opportunity, or something changes, or the fruits of our labors come in, or something like that. There's a huge human component that when you get that big opportunity, you want to change something because you want to make it better. It's sort of an homage to the big opportunity, but that's always an error. It's always an error. What you need to do is do the things that got you there in the first place. And that's true politically, it's true financial system wise. You can't do the things that have been successful and then get a big opportunity or have a big problem and change those successful things into something else, because maybe you're changing it to something else and maybe you'll knock it out of the park, but you're taking a gamble because you don't know the long-term effects of the drastic change. And so by changing that, you're successful, the things that you had done successfully previously, you're entering additional risk into that.
If I understood you correctly, the wisdom is reach a lot of change, but change one thing at a time and see what happens. So
yeah, gradual, and just remember what worked. And I think that we tend to take what worked for granted. And sometimes, I see this all the time. People get big opportunities, or they get bigger budgets, or they suddenly just change their operating basis, and they don't recognize that's the operating basis that got them there. And I would say that about the United States, whatever we appreciate about the United States. And, there were such huge benefits from immigration. Obviously, that's, almost irrefutable. but it was the way that we went about it that got us there. And so we've drastically changed how we're letting people into this country. And we don't know if that's going to be a hero or a zero. Do they all go in and get jobs and make us 20 times more productive? We don't know yet. Do they, are there terrorist cells embedded into this? Do the drug overdoses increase? We don't know yet, right? And so, but by doing this sort of different thing than we've always done before, we're entering additional risk in. And what you're saying is the Fed is reversing the pace at which they usually employ their monetary policy tools. And it's either a hero or a zero, but they are definitely entering additional risk into the system by changing the rates and the nature that they've done things as, they've always done things.
Well, let's hope and pray they don't break things too hard with what they've done. Well, we'll see. And thank you again for all your wisdom and your sharing, and I appreciate you. And I like to say this, like many other things, all good things must come to an end. So does this episode.
Well, thank you, Mike. I so appreciate it. It's always my pleasure.
Thank you, Frances.
Thank you for listening to the Big Mike Fund Podcast. To receive your copy of Mike's How to Choose a Smart Real Estate Fund book, head to bigmikefund.com or visit Amazon and type Mike Zlotnick. Keep listening and keep investing Big Mike style. See you on the next episode.